Okay, so you keep drawing and talking about how this is a Christian thing. You mentioned that Catholic, the Catholics, Latin Church, the Eastern Church, say the Byzantine Church. You even mentioned the Oriental
Yeah.
churches, the Coptic churches, Armenian Orthodox, so on and so forth. Protestants, or at least in the early forms, all believe this. So, and you mentioned, I got to ask you this. So, why does this just become portrayed as an Eastern Orthodox thing? Right? Why is it that it's the
Yeah.
Orthodox who believe this? Where did that come from?
So I mean, it's a fascinating story. Obviously, because the doctrine is playing on the broad semantic range of the Greek word theos, it works better in Greek to say these things than it does in many of the other languages, right? So there is a risk of misunderstanding that terminology when you translate it. Nonetheless, the Latin fathers did translate the terminology as deificatio, from which we get deification, and they used it, but it wasn't perhaps the most popular term in their vocabulary simply because it is too easily misunderstood. Some of the other Christian traditions appropriated the concept but never had a particular word for it. So if you read, say, in the Syriac tradition, Ephraim the Syrian or Isaac and Nineveh, they clearly have this concept, but they don't have a word for the concept. They simply express it by means of things like what's called the patristic exchange formula. He became what we are, that we might become what he is. Right? That's probably across all traditions the most common way of expressing this doctrine, and it comes in a lot of variant forms. So he was made human that we might be made divine.
Hmm.
I mean, they're all over the tradition, trying to convey this same idea, right? And the background to that is actually biblical teaching, things like the Apostle Paul saying, he who was rich became poor for our sake, that we might become rich.
Hmm.
Or he became sin that we might become the righteousness of God. Right? That pattern of exchange is there in a variety of places in the New Testament. But the language is easily misunderstood. And even in the Greek fathers, we see sometimes Greek fathers backing away from the language, but not the concept. So, for example, in the 400s, when the Nestorian controversy breaks out, Cyril of Alexandria has used the traditional Greek term theopoiesis
Hmm.
to make gods or to make theos in his early writings, but it can be misunderstood in the context of the Nestorian controversy to mean something different, as if you're becoming a deity or as if Jesus's divinity was somehow derivative or participatory. And so Cyril backs away from that language and doesn't use that theopoiesis term so much. Instead, he adapts or adopts Second Peter's phrase, becoming partakers of the divine nature, and a few other ways of getting at this idea. Among the Latin medievals, this idea is known. John Scotus Eriugena in the 900s comments on it, and he says, "Well, gosh, we see this theopoiesis, theosis language in these Greek writers, many of whom he was translating into Latin. We don't see it as often, but we do sometimes see it in Latin writers." At the time of the Reformation, there were a number of heterodox movements in what we call the Radical Reformation, who
Hmm.
had divinizing notions that would be deemed heterodox by all the main Christian traditions. And they were teaching things that were often confused with this traditional Christian way of understanding the goal or telos of salvation. So we get to, say, the late 1500s, and somebody like Martin Chemnitz, a prominent Lutheran theologian, comments that the words theosis and theopoiesis are perfectly fine terms if you understand them as the church fathers do. However, he says, because of the ravings of that madman Caspar Schrenkweld. We can't use them in public without long explanations. And he says, oh,
Mm.
it's probably better just to teach the idea, but not get tripped up over the wording. During the Puritan era, a century later, we find similar things. There were anti Trinitarian groups in England that were teaching heterodox divinizing notions. And the Orthodox Anglicans and Puritans were often wanting to agree with the church fathers, but to also distance themselves from these heterodox notions. Now, as a result of all of this, the language recedes to the background, becomes something that tends to be known only by academics, people doing church history or patristics kind of research. You get to the 19th century, and it's strange language to people. And when the whole theories of atonement way of thinking about the work of Christ comes on the scene, it gets described as a physical understanding of salvation, that Jesus enters our humanity, and because of this physical connection between the logos and human nature, therefore humanity is divinized. And that's obviously a crude and backwards kind of notion, doesn't have any role for human morality and ethics, seems to be incompatible with justification. And German liberal theologians jump on this and develop an apologetic for a Germanic Christianity in which the linchpin of the whole argument is the idea that the East has deification, the West has justification, and that the two are incompatible.
Mm.
So Albrecht Ritschl, who isn't often spoken about today, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, he was perhaps the most prominent systematic theologian around. Ritschl makes the claim that you have this kind of division, and what he really wants to do is get rid of the dogmas of Trinity and incarnation. That's just incompatible with a modern view of Christianity. And his students, people like Wilhelm Hermann, Julius Kofkin, and most famously Adolf von Harnack, developed this argument with a lot of sophistication. And it comes down to this idea that, well, the church fathers had this idea of deification. They picked it up not from scripture, not from Jesus, but from Plato and Hellenistic philosophy. So Harnack puts this forward as the famous Hellenization of Christianity thesis. And what he argues is that the Trinity and the Incarnation are the products of an illicit affair between the gospel and Hellenism. And the linchpin is deification because he observed that Athanasius and some of the Cappadocians and others make an argument for the Trinity, for the full deity of Christ, from the kind of salvation Christ secures for us, namely theopoiesis, or deification. The idea being that if Jesus is going to be able to grant to us deification, which is a derivative kind of divineness, right? It's by participation. It's by sharing. It's a gift given to us. It's not something natural to us or inherent to us. And if we are participating in his divinity, his immortality, his incorruption, he must possess those things by nature, in and of himself, just as the Father does, one with the Father. So the early fathers make these arguments for the Trinity and deity of Christ from the fact that he divinizes us. And so Harnack, Ritschl, and these others say there's the key to the whole thing. If you want to get rid of the Trinity and the Incarnation, you have to show that they derive from deification. Deification is a Hellenistic notion. And they argue that with Luther, this is ironic because Luther has a lot to say in favor of deification. He makes a number of statements that are clearly in line with the Church Fathers. But they argued that Luther was bringing the West back toward a biblical view. He was building on what Augustine had done. Harnack has a footnote where he says that he acknowledges, well, yeah, deification's in Augustine, but if I'm not wrong, it was Augustine himself who brought it to an end in the West. The idea was that Augustine had emphasized justification by faith in forensic categories in salvation, and thus it's really Augustine's theology that undermines deification. And Ritschl and his followers saw themselves as completing Luther's work of completing Augustine to get rid of deification altogether in favor of an understanding of salvation that is focused only on justification by faith alone. So it becomes the gospel becomes the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and justification by faith alone. And thus they could have a modern Christianity that does away with these Hellenistic dogmas of Trinity and incarnation that modern men just can't actually believe these days. And this was part of an apologetic for a Germanic Christianity. So they said, look, the Greeks, they're the most primitive of the Christian groups. Their theology is indebted to Greek philosophy. Their worship is filled with ritualism and legalism. They really did not like Eastern Orthodoxy. Harnack had firsthand acquaintance with Eastern Orthodoxy because he was born in the Baltic states, which had a large German population at the time, but also a large Russian population. They looked at that as the Eastern Orthodoxy represents Christianity going astray due to the baneful effects of Hellenism. Catholicism is better, especially when Augustine is in ascendancy. But when Augustine's influence wanes, Catholicism becomes too much like Orthodoxy. But then you get Germanic Christianity with Luther. And the Germanic Christianity is the superior Christianity. It's better than Latin. It's way better than Greek. And this is all happening at the time that the German states are unifying, that we're getting lots of the racial ideology that will ultimately lead to the Third Reich. And I don't think it's coincidental that the superiority of a Germanic form of Christianity is really what they're trying to establish with this argument that is supposed to be a patristic church history kind of argument. But what they're wanting to do is undermine the whole of Nicene Christianity in favor of a modern liberal Protestantism. Now, if that weren't enough, Eastern Orthodox scholars appropriated the Ritschlian Harnack narrative. So you get the communist revolution in Russia. And a lot of Eastern Orthodox priests, theologians, and laity end up moving into the West. And they're trying to find an identity for themselves within the West, which is dominated by Catholic and Protestant thought. And for them, the narrative that Ritschl and Harnack put out is very congenial for creating a distinctive Eastern Orthodox identity and to say, hey, we are being faithful to the church fathers and to Scripture. We have deification. You guys don't. You guys are apostate. You guys have gone astray. How did you go astray? Well, it's Augustine and all that juridical thinking and justification, or it's Aquinas and scholasticism, or it's Protestantism and nominalism, or whatever. It comes in there's several causes listed. But the basic idea is, well, we have deification or theosis, the West doesn't, and this is the intellectual boundary between the two. So you end up with very prominent Protestant scholars, very prominent Eastern Orthodox scholars telling the same basic narrative. This looks like the consensus of critical scholarship. Surely this must be the assured results that we can all just accept without question, because these are huge scholars, right? Harnack and Florovsky, Ritschl and Losky, they're all in agreement. And then there were some Catholic scholars who also chipped in, also supporting this narrative. And then you end up with deification or theosis being associated exclusively with Eastern Orthodoxy, seen as utterly incompatible with Western theology, but especially Protestant theology. And it's that way for about 50, 60 years before scholars begin to look at the primary sources and say, hey, wait a minute. That idea, I see it right here in Hilary of Poitiers, or I see it in Aquinas, or Bonaventure, or Luther, or Calvin, or Zwingli, and it goes on. Jonathan Edwards, C.S. Lewis. It's all over the Western tradition.